I think we're live and on. So good morning,
We are.
everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to be here this morning. And I want to jump right into this because we have time is a precious commodity and I want to respect everybody's time. So for starters, we're beyond thrilled to have two global cultural corporate icons here this morning to share their experiences and ideas with you. So we're grateful for you showing up. We're grateful for your interest, your participation. We obviously think this is very important in today's age, so we want to sort of jump into how we address what's going on. Very quickly, for those that don't know, my name is Brian Bach. I'm a 25-year veteran of the executive search industry, and I'm co-hosting today with my business partner, 𝙃𝙤𝙬. And Harry is a 30-year veteran of the executive search industry. So prior to getting started, real quick, I want to just jump into some admin details so everyone's sort of understanding what's going on here. For starters, this session is being recorded. We encourage your engagement, and you'll see if you hover over your screen, the chat box, you can ask questions in the chat box. And we prefer that you do this as we go because we're going to try to answer those questions live as we go instead of waiting till the end to have a Q&A session. So if you prefer anonymity in your question, you can direct your question in that chat box directly to Harry. If you don't care, you can just throw it out there to the group and everyone will be able to see that you're the one asking the question. And then following this session, we will send out a list of attendees. And the spirit of that is just in transparency so people have an idea of who was on this conversation this morning. That's the only reason that we're sending that out. And we'd ask everyone that's being sent to respect a no marketing policy on that list. So if you don't want to be on the list, you can certainly send Harry or I a note and we will make sure that we don't add you to the list. But the idea is to put that list together so everyone can kind of see who was on this conversation. So jumping into this, obviously the reason we're doing this is because the world's gotten wound pretty tight with COVID and all the social unrest, and organizations ironically are finding themselves thrust right into the middle of this fray, and they're doing it without a playbook because this is all new for everybody. So that brings me to why we're doing this. We are trying to imagine a playbook, which to us means creating corporate environments that ultimately allow for all employees to flourish, which is to say that it allows everyone to be the best version of themselves. So this requires that we first know something about human beings and then know something about corporate cultures. So with that, I'm just, like I said, beyond thrilled to introduce Dave Sparkman and Bob Keeler, who I would say know a lot about human beings and a lot about corporate cultures. So first of all, Dave reported directly to Steve Hemsley, the CEO of UnitedHealth Group, and Dave's role was to lead a cultural change initiative envisioned by Steve for the entire organization of over 300,000 employees. Think about that titanic movement. That's profound. And then we have Bob, who is the CEO of a global engineering and consulting firm with roughly 40,000 employees. And he believed that living organizational core values, not simply defining them, was an imperative that had to be modeled by him as the CEO. And his unique approach to doing this was one of the most fascinating business imperatives I've ever personally observed. So hopefully we'll get into that a little bit as we go. So just real quick, in summary, we have one individual who is tasked to execute the cultural vision of the CEO, and we have another whose task it was to create that vision. So this dialogue should really accommodate everyone on this that's participating in this dialogue. So I want to start by asking a question of both Bob and Dave. I'll probably throw this to Dave first, but the question is this. Throughout the course of your career, I'm just interested in hearing you give an overview of what you observed through the course of your career related to how companies that you participated in did culture, how they did mission, values, and what worked and what didn't. So Dave, I will start with you. Why don't you give us an overview of what you personally experienced in that realm, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And so I'll take the next 90 minutes to explain my career, how that happened. I think the first thing looking back, I didn't really realize what corporate culture was. I was a 22-year-old college graduate with an accounting degree, starting with a firm called Arthur Andersen. And I had interned the previous summer, started down in the Atlanta office. And the first thing I experienced of looking back, what became the foundation, I believe, of Arthur Andersen's culture was sending all of us to professional training at their facility in St. Charles, Illinois. Every single hire at Arthur Andersen that was on the audit, tax, or consulting side went to that training center. And through that, you started to get a feel for what I have heard many times as a definition of culture of just the way we do things around here. We started on time, we end on time, we had a lot of fun, we worked really, really hard. We learned that the client need was above all other needs, and that's why we were there. And no matter what happened, day or night, we were to serve them. So that was the introduction in a corporate experience, if you will, to corporate culture, although no one really called it that. We had 7 values that I faintly remembered as a young person going through the organization. But one thing that was made clear also to us was a phrase called think straight, talk straight. And we were encouraged that whatever was on our mind, we needed to take that up with our supervisor, discuss it, and they would shoot straight with us back. So that stayed with me all the way to the end of Arthur Andersen. I was there at the end when we hit that little bump called Enron. At the time, I was responsible for the HR function within the West region. Houston sat within my region, so felt the epicenter of that eventual destruction of Arthur Andersen. And my job then became, once the indictments came out, was to sell or fire everyone in the company in my region. So with a lot of people's help, did that. And we also found cultural foundations, even at the very end. It was probably what I would call the strongest unification of our firm that I had ever seen. When the attack came from the outside, our partners banded together and actually worked more cohesively than I had seen them work for a long time. So Arthur Andersen, beginning in one half of my career, and then UnitedHealth Group on the other, where I learned a great deal more about culture, and I'm still learning about corporate culture.
Thank you, Dave. From my own perspective, I guess I started working in the energy industry in 1986. I worked for a number of different organizations, and I saw lots of examples of what I would call clumsy management and leadership, treating people badly, so badly that they effectively switched off in terms of supporting the organization. And at the same time, lots of these organizations talked highly about their culture and their values and their mission and all this other stuff. And I work with entrepreneurs a lot nowadays, and I tell them to avoid what I call ESP, which is empty sales piss, because really a lot of it is just nonsense words that mean nothing. And a lot of what was said about corporate culture was just stuff that was done by marketing that really bore no relation to what was happening within the organization. And that kind of led me to the conclusion that there simply had to be a better way. There just had to be a better way. Because what I saw was insincere, it was superficial, potentially damaging. And I'm not saying the organizations necessarily had really bad cultures, it just bore no resemblance to how it was described corporately, and therefore people didn't have any faith in the idea that this was something deliberate. So if I jump forward a little bit to, it was the 15th of March in 2006. For those of you who know Shakespeare, that would be the Ides of March. And I'm sitting at breakfast one morning. I was in the middle of leading a management buyout, a $280 million management buyout from Halliburton Corporation. And I was getting ready to create a new spin-out company on the 1st of May. And at that point, we had no name, no branding, no identity. We'd sorted out lots of other things about finance and operations and assets and all that other stuff. But we still had a way to go, and there was something nagging me. And I was sitting at breakfast. I was eating one of these. I'm eating a banana, and I'm thinking to myself, why is this banana a banana? An existential question. And it came back to the idea that in 1953, when Thomas Watson and Francis Crick unraveled the helix of DNA they found that DNA is made up of only 4 basic building blocks. And the way that in which these building blocks combine determine the physical characteristics of you and me and every other living thing on the planet. And I thought, what are the building blocks of this new company going to be? What are the things that are going to determine how we grow? So I rushed into the office that day and I said to my colleagues, guys, we need to talk about DNA. And they looked at me as if I had 2 heads. I said, we need to talk about building blocks. We need to talk about cornerstone principles, core values, if you like. And they said, why? We're quite busy. I said, because if we don't get it right, we'll end up being the company that we never wanted to be. So let's take this opportunity to get it right. The upshot was, we thought it would take us a couple of hours. It took us about 4 days in total, but eventually we got to a small set of values. We then shared them with the wider organization and refined them. We put the values into practice and we realized we didn't want to be the same as what we'd seen before. So we went about deliberately living and breathing the values, and I'm sure we'll come more onto this. But the upshot was, within 2 years, what had been on day one in May the 1st, 2006, a Halliburton organization, within 2 years was substantially and dramatically different. And that made a huge difference to the clients, it made a huge difference to the staff, and it made a huge difference to the shareholders of the business. And it also made a big difference to the communities where we operated. And I can provide more information on that as necessary. We were in a fiercely competitive arena. We couldn't differentiate ourselves technically that easily. We couldn't differentiate ourselves commercially. But we differentiated ourselves by being different, by having a culture that meant that clients liked to work with us. And in some cases, they would forgo going to market for a 5-year contract and come straight to us and say, we like working with you guys because you're decent, you're honest, and you're professional. Therefore, we're going to award you a 5-year contract with no competitive process. So it was fantastic for business. And as a result of that, we were able to sell the business for $1 billion 5 years later.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And like I said, I certainly have been fascinated by all the things that I observed Bob doing in those days as CEO. And that's just a little glimpse of some of it. And so thank you for that, both of you. I think you both come from places that are hopefully going to be incredibly valuable for everyone on this call. So we titled this talk, How Your Mission and Values Undermine Culture. And Dave, maybe we'll throw this back to you too. How does that happen, and what do we mean by that? How do mission and values potentially undermine culture, and what can we do about that? I'll let you take that, Dave.
Yeah, for me, what that means is if you say this is what you want your culture to be, but then don't live it out, just as Bob was reflecting, you're undermining yourself tremendously because you've set expectations of what you're targeting. And those values may be core to what you currently do, or they may be aspirational. But if your walk doesn't back up your talk, then you have set it up for failure. And even though you may have a few champions within the organization, such as the people on this call trying to carry the flag of what the mission and the core values are, if the practices surrounding that aren't consistent, people will quickly write it off. None of us really like hypocrisy, and that's what it will be seen as. That was what my experience was.
Would you, Dave, knowing what happened with Enron and a particular partner at Arthur Andersen, would you say that the culture of the organization made it possible for that kind of malfeasance to occur within Arthur Andersen?
First, it was not malfeasance. We'll start with that. The indictment was eventually reversed, of course, after the firm had been destroyed, but we were found completely innocent of everything. But at the time, Brian, that was the case. And certainly I had the opportunity probably about a decade later to actually have a breakfast with the CEO of Arthur Andersen. And we had this conversation. And it was absolutely that there could have been, should have been more work, more foundational, as Bob was just explaining, to revisit our values. Arthur Andersen was, I think, started in 1913 or something like that. So it was, decades old. but to revisit the values, to re-inject the values, to refresh the values. I don't think we would have changed them, but for those of you who recall the history, Arthur Andersen spawned a little company that's now called Accenture. And so first we went through this huge divorce, which I was a part of, and you saw the cultural fraying at that point in time, which then I believe led to the eventual downfall of the firm.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And thanks for the correction. I actually did not know that ultimately Arthur Andersen got a pass on that. I did not realize that. So thank you for correcting that. But appreciate those comments.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And Bob, I know you touched on this already a little bit, but how mission and values can undermine a corporation. How would you expound on that?
Yeah, I think, we've all been part of organizations where we hear commitments being made and the commitments are not followed through on, and sometimes for good reasons. We intend to go and operate a new site, but it turns out that we haven't got the permits or we've lost the contract or whatever. So things change and people can accept that. But when you put something so fundamental in front of people and say, this is who we are, and then you don't follow up on that, that's a deeper level of mistrust. Because if you're going to tell me that this is who we are, and then you're going to take actions that demonstrate this is actually not who we are, then you undermine my trust in the most deepest level. So everything else you say to me, I'm going to look through that lens and say, actually, I'm not sure I can take this. So I think insincerity around culture and values is more damaging than insincerity or inaccuracy in other areas of the business. Let me give you an example. We've been talking about from the financial service industry. If you take Barclays, for instance, Barclays Bank, again, a historic organization that went back a couple of hundred years. And post the kind of financial crisis and that, there was lots of stuff came out in the wash about lots of different organizations. But the upshot was that Barclays were fined huge amounts of money for various malpractices of mis-selling, of misrepresentation, of various other things. So they commissioned a QC to come in and do an independent report. And the report basically said this organization failed because there was no single view of culture. There was no single view of the core values that should support that culture. And as a result of that, they said that's where it all went wrong, because people lost faith in what they were there for, and they ended up being driven by different motives, such as profits and bonuses and maximizing returns or doing well in the pecking order. And the report that was done by the QC, Anthony Saltz, basically, which cost them $13 million, basically said, you just need to get your values back. If you get your values back and put them at the heart of your business, this organization can go back and be a good organization again. So when they brought in a new CEO in 2013, he wrote a note to the whole organization saying, we're stopping here, we're recalibrating, we're going back to doing what we should be doing. And if this doesn't suit anybody in the organization, this is the time to leave. You need to get out, which I thought was really quite bold at the time. I'd love to think that was the end of their problems, but it wasn't. They had problems beyond that for market manipulation and various other things. And I think some of that illustrates the point that they're a big organization. It takes a long time to change culture. The best time to start is 10 years ago. You can't always do that, but it takes a long time for these things to move. So it takes constant attention. It takes an obsessive drive, and it takes an absolutely clear vision from somebody that's got the mandate to be able to pull that through. So it isn't a sticking plaster approach where you can do something different in 2 months or even 2 years sometimes. It takes a long time to shift the culture in an organization, and in a big organization, it takes even longer.
You're actually touching on a Chinese proverb. I love the fact that the best time to do culture is 10 years ago. Yeah. According to Chinese proverb, there's 2 ideal times to plant a tree: 10 years ago and today.
Yeah.
So no different than culture. Ideally it would have been 10 years ago, but we start today if that's where we are, and starting today. So I love it. Okay, so moving on. We're talking about sort of this mindset shift, shifting the way people think. And we're doing that in tens with your guys' experience with tens of thousands of people. Very difficult to do that. Sort of how do we change hearts and minds, predominantly shifting how we operate. So it seems like it's critical to be able to do that. Otherwise, we could say, here's the memo of our culture, just implement it. But that's not what works. It's not practical. So what did you individually do to start shifting people's mindset to enable that cultural change to happen in your organizations? Again, Dave will get you to launch us off on that.
Well, two things come to mind, and I know Bob's going to have a field day with this. So first, I would, in shifting minds, first I would say that words matter a lot, and I want to leverage what Bob had mentioned earlier about getting together and for 4 days figuring out what the building blocks of the DNA are. We actually had our chief medical officer at UnitedHealth Group do a presentation on culture and DNA, which was fascinating, exactly to what Bob very clearly described that he went through. But I recently saw a video where a gentleman used a quote from, of course, a foundation of truth of a movie called The Princess Bride. Mm. And there's a character called Inigo Montoya, and it's a famous scene, and he says, "That word you keep using, I do not think it means what you think it means." Words matter quite a bit. And so one of the things we did at UnitedHealth Group was to define what our core values were and describe what it meant, both in what we believed, what we valued, and how we should behave. And there was a lot of thought that went through that, groups of people. But ultimately, our CEO, Steve Hemsley's fingerprints were all over that. He owned the introduction of our new core values to the organization. Yeah. So that would be one thing, because through that dialogue and through that ongoing discussion that to this day still happens, people start to have insights about, well, that word you use, it doesn't mean what I thought it meant. So that's one area. The second area is to actually go through exercises, or we had a culture workshop that was 2 days long that we would put literally every director and above through at our organization. And that continued for the 9 years that I was there as part of the culture journey. And through that, you lead people down a path where it's their own behaviors, there's no tricks to it, and they find themselves convicting themselves of their own thinking. They find themselves coming up with conclusions that, as they then go through the exercise, they realize there could be a better way, right? UnitedHealth Group has been successful for years, decades, year after quarter, beating analyst estimates. And yet our CEO, Steve Hemsley, said there's got to be more here. There's more potential that we are not tapping into. So even though he had done the words back when he joined the company in 1998, he refers to this story often. I came up with that with a group of senior leaders. We called it Rules of the Road, and it went on the binder and promptly on the shelf. And the firm did not reflect those values at all. So he had the courage to say, we need to do something different. We have the right strategy. We have the right structure, pick your poison, but our culture is not supporting the implementation of those two things to the degree that it could. And so in 2009, we pushed reset, and that led us down the journey. So two things: one, words matter a lot. Number two, going through some discussion and exercises that help reveal people's thinking, allowing them the invitation to change their thinking, was very critical to us in the culture transformation that we underwent.
That's really interesting, Dave, because it's almost identical to my own experiences, that we found that, identifying values is nice and easy, because if you just use general terms, they can mean anything to anybody. Mm-hmm. So one of our values is integrity. Yeah, you can have integrity. You can also have respect. You can have these words that mean so big and wide. So what we found is we've got to narrow down the definition and say, what do we mean by that? So for each one of our values, we would take the heading and would say, okay, why do we care about this? What does it mean to everybody in the organization? And if the answer was, well, it doesn't apply to everybody in the organization, then you would say, is it really a core value? So we need to check that as a potential test. And then the third thing we said was, okay, if that is the case, what obligation does that put on us as an organization towards everybody within the organization? So by setting up these three things, it meant that each value needed 3 or 4 sentences to describe exactly what we meant by it. And that helped us hugely when it came to decision making later on and justifying potentially contentious decisions, because it allowed us to look at it analytically and say, no, this is exactly in line with the values, not the heading of the value that somebody else may reinterpret and attach their own meaning to, but what we mean by it. So it allowed us to make potentially controversial decisions because we knew it was in line with the values. The second thing that you mentioned, Dave, there was about the idea of training people on culture. I've mentioned the metaphor of DNA before. So our training program was called Cracking the Code. Come and crack the code, the DNA code. And we spent, in our case, it was a single day, but on that single day, we presented people with scenarios and case studies and asked them to debate what they would do and what they wouldn't do. And then throughout the day, we introduced the values and we asked them to examine case studies. And what we found is at the start of the day, we had people that would fall into camps and say, yeah, I would definitely fire that person. No, I wouldn't. Or we would walk away from that contract. No, we wouldn't, etc. By the end of the day, we were saying, actually, we're all making the same decisions because we're basing on the same reference, which is our core values. So people could see that the core values could help them in their roles about when is it the right thing to do and when is it not the right thing to do. And that was a great convergence that we took people through in the course of a day. They could say, these core values can actually help me. They're not just a corporate thing that I've got to comply with. Now, on the other side there, Brian, you asked about shifting in thinking. What we found was that the values provided effectively a boundary or a limit within which people could change the way they think. It gave them a degree of freedom that perhaps wasn't there before. And we encourage people to say, look, if we're going to be different, we need to do things differently. So we're open to new ideas. We want to try new ideas. We're happy to encourage people to try things and potentially not be successful. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. For instance, is, we were a service contractor and the idea of us saying no to a client was something historically that we would never have done. But because we had the values in place, we could look at every opportunity through the lens of those values and say, occasionally a piece of work will come our way and we'll say no. So one of our biggest clients was Shell, and Shell came to us to say, we've got this piece of consultancy work for you, and it's in the Nigerian Delta area, and we'd like you to come and help us. And we looked at it and we looked at our values and we went to them and we said, no, we can't do it. And they were shocked and they said, why is that? They said, well, it's down to one of our values is about safety and security. And at the moment, the kidnapping risk in that area is particularly high. Now, you as a big oil company have massive security operation there that you can deal with. We as a relatively small consultancy company don't have that. And therefore, our people would be facing undue risk. On that basis, despite the commercial attractiveness of it, we have to say no because it's inconsistent with our values. And they said, but your competitors are willing to do it. And we said, that's their choice. That is their choice. Now, you might think that would damage our relationship with Shell, but it didn't. It strengthened our relationship with Shell because it was another example to them of how honest we were and how married we were to our own values and how we weren't going to give them away for any commercial pressures and things like that. So that was another idea. Another idea that we'd inherited as part of the management buyout was we had a staff appraisal system that involved ranking people into different categories. Now, we didn't fire the bottom category automatically or anything like that, so it wasn't as brutal as that. But I did ask the question and say, what benefit is it really providing? And when we analysed it, we came to the conclusion the only benefit it provided us was that when it came to allocating things like bonuses, you had a nice way of putting some numbers into a spreadsheet. But the damage it was causing was huge because it was completely diverting people away from the real benefit of appraisal processes, which is to talk about people's development and growth and their needs and all the things they need. And that was all being swamped because people wanted to know, what's my ranking? And why am I not one above wherever you've ranked me? And if I'm at the top and I've been there 2 years, then why am I not the CEO like you? So it really distorted the process. So we said, let's do away with the ranking part of it and keep the discussion part of it. And initially we were told, it'll end up chaos, but it didn't. It ended up creating adult grown-up conversations between people about real development needs. What it also did, however, is it put an onus on managers to say, if you come across any examples of poor performance, you can't just kick the can down the road and talk about it later on or reflect it in the ranking. You've got to deal with it when you see it. So it kind of made everybody a little sharper in saying, okay, we've taken away this, but we need to replace it with responsibility. We did the same thing with individual performance bonuses. And this is going to make me, coming from Europe, sound like some socialist communist here, but it's not, genuinely. What we realized is that everything we did was a team effort. And nobody was going to succeed without the benefit of the team around about them. So we recognized that the best thing for us to do was to have a team bonus pot. And it wasn't really an incentive bonus, it was a thank you bonus. So what we said to people is, do your job, do your best, go out there, and at the end of the year, if we all do a great job, and we've, as a result of that, we've generated some income that we can put into the bonus pot, we'll share it out equitably, and we'll say thank you for all your efforts. And that was what we did. So we took away incentive bonuses and replaced them with thank yous and gratitude for the job well done. And final example that I've talked to Dave before is, we were in a market at the time where it was really tough and people were poaching people from other companies and paying higher wages and all that kind of stuff. And we were in this catch-22 situation that our clients would come to us and said, we'd like to see the team that you've got for this job. And we would say, well, the team's not here because until we get the contract, people won't come and join us. And then I said, again, there has to be a better way than this. So I threw the challenge to my HR team. And I said, what can you do about this? And they came back and said, we've got this concept. Why don't we turn our vacancy list into waiting lists? I said, go on, tell me more. They said, well, what we'll have is a waiting list, a gold waiting list, which is effectively people that are currently working in an organization that we know are going to be coming free at some point in the future because their project that they're working on is coming to an end. People that we know, people already in an organization. The silver list will be people that have worked for us before, but are currently working for our competitors. And they've already expressed a desire to come back when there's work available. And the third list, the bronze list, will be, we'll take all the resumes and CVs that we've had into the business, and we will filter and filter and filter, and we will find the people that we would normally offer a job to, and we'll call these pre-screened people the bronze list. So then what we did is, when we were bidding for contracts, we would say, here's the people that will satisfy that contract, the gold, silver, and bronze. So we were actually bidding for work using our competitors' employees, really, to win the work. And when we won the work, everybody came and joined us, and we got the contracts, and we moved forward, and our competitors all shook their heads and said, how did you win that work when you didn't have the people? We did have the people, we just had them labeled incorrectly because we were thinking differently. So a good example to illustrate that point, I think.
Great point. Bob, this is Harry. We have a question. You mentioned earlier that you created 3 or 4 sentences around the values in order to define them for your organization. Can you give an example of what some of those 3 or 4 sentences looked like?
Yeah, something like, so for instance, if one of our core values is around people, you would say, why do we value people? So the first sentence would be, say, we understand that the people in our organization are the fundamental building block of everything we do. So that's why we care about the people in the organization. And then we would say something like, our obligation is for everybody to treat everybody else openly, fairly, and with respect. And there's an obligation now, the third part was on leadership, to do the same, but also to exercise compassion when it was appropriate. And that compassion word was interesting. And let me share one story in response to that, Harry, if I can, was that it was the April 2013. I'd been out of the office all week. I came back into my head office in Aberdeen, and an email popped up on my screen, and I thought, I'll leave that, I can answer that on Monday. But then curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it up, and it said, Bob, this is Caroline, you don't know me, I'm an oncology nurse. This is my cell phone number. And I thought, why would an oncology nurse be calling me? So I thought I better call back, because you never know what this is about. It could be something to do with a relative or something. So I called this number. I said, "Hi, Caroline, it's Bob Keeler here." And she went, "I just emailed you." I said, "Yep, that's why I'm calling you." I said, "What can I do for you?" She said, "Well, you don't know this, but one of your members of staff is suffering from quite an aggressive form of cancer. And but the good thing is he's been getting this new treatment that's doing, really effective." And I went, "Oh, that's good. Yeah, he's got 3 young children below the age of 10 years old. And this treatment is being funded by your health insurance provider." And I went, "Oh, that's good." They agreed to provide that for 12 months. I went, "Oh, good news, good news." She said, "Yeah, that was a year ago." I went, "Oh, so what do you want me to do?" She says, "Can you help? These drugs, this drug therapy is very expensive." I said, "Caroline, I don't know," was the honest answer, "but let me take that back to my team. I've got a team meeting on Tuesday. I'll come back to you on Tuesday. I'm not wanting to get your hopes up, but I'll come back to you." So on the Monday morning, I met my head of HR at the time, Sue, and Sue McDonald had been in the industry for many years, and she'd heard about this situation. So she came to me and said, "Oh, Bob, you'll not know about this person who's got this." And I said, "I know about it, Sue." She says, "I've been here before. We really can't help. It sets an undue precedent. We can't do this. So best thing is just to go back and say we can't help. Sad though it is, that's the extent of it." I said, "Sue, I committed to taking it into leadership team. Let's do that." Took it into leadership team. We'd finished our agenda, and I said, "There's one final item. Sue will describe the situation to you. What do you think?" And everybody's stopped looking at me. And I thought, I interpreted that as they want to say no, but they don't want to be the person whose lips the words come from. So I'm kind of saying, "Come on, guys, what do we think? What do we think?" And then somebody said, "Yeah, we get requests like this all the time." I said, Do we? When was the last request like this we considered in this room? Because I can't remember it. Yeah, so maybe we don't get requests just like this all the time. Then somebody else said, "It would set an unworkable precedent." I went, "Okay, so we're a court of law now. We're obliged to be consistent with every decision that we make. Surely we can consider every decision on the merits of the individual context at the time." They said, "Yeah." I said, somebody else said, "Should we not be looking at this through core values?" I'm saying, "Yeah, of course we should. Thank you. We're there." So we looked at the core values, and we looked at the people core value, and it had the word compassion in it. And everybody started packing up their things and moving out of the room. I said, "Oh, well, hang on a minute." They said, "Well, the answer's there. We've got to provide the support. We've got to fund this drug therapy." Now, we were lucky in that we were a big enough company that we could afford to do that. If we'd been a smaller company, much as we'd like to have done it, we possibly couldn't have done it anyway. So we're walking out the room, and I could see Sue had moist eyes, and she wasn't known for her soft side. And tears actually running down one of her cheeks. And I went there, I said, "Sue, are you okay?" And she turned to me and she said, "You and your core values, you and your core values." She said, I get the core values on an intellectual level. I've always got that. But I've never really known what it meant at an emotional level. And today, that was my eureka moment. She said, "I've never seen anything like that in 30 years in the industry. No other management team would have made that decision. And I'm so proud that we made that decision here today." So that's an example of what it lets you do in terms of once you've defined the values in some detail. I hope, Harry, that long rambling answer answers questions that Amy's put forward, or whoever put it forward.
That's great. I have another question, Dave. I'll direct to you. Is this is very relevant today, obviously, as everyone went to remote work through COVID, and now companies considering transitioning back. What's the right balance, and how is that going to impact culture in the long run?
Have no idea what the right balance is. I think that potentially could be different for every company on the planet, because every company is unique with how they serve their clients, how they raise revenue, et cetera. I think it will be a long-term cultural impact, even as illustrated by our conversation this morning, right? And I'm in California, Bob's in Scotland, you guys are in Minneapolis. I mean, it's easy now for us to communicate. On the same token, proximity counts for something. There's a lot of conversations that happen in the hallways after work hours, or, so how do you place a value on that? And I think every senior management team is going to need to struggle. I would encourage them to struggle with it and not just default to the way things were or the way things are, but to really, what I would call, not have a second grade education on this. What I mean by that is senior management, to me, is paid what they're paid for their experience and for the decision process, much like Bob just described in his story, to wrestle with things. And I'm hopeful that companies around the world will look at the results that were achieved in 2020 with all of the chaos that happened and what's happening already in 21, and say, let's look at each department, let's look at each function, let's really figure out what can make the most sense here. In my opinion, there's gold to be mined from this on a lot of levels, both from a productivity perspective, from a compassion perspective, from new policies on childcare perspective. There's a lot that can be done to use that value lens to see life a little bit differently because of this pandemic and the technology tools that most of us are now pretty adept at using. So that, just a short burst back on that. I'd love to hear, Bob, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Dave, listen, I echo all the things you said there. I don't know if there is an answer or if people really know the answer. One of the companies that I'm involved in, for instance, I've urged them not to try and come up with a definitive solution, because I've said you can't make that decision at this point in time. Only being able to look at things retrospectively will give you the clarity to say, well, what was right, what was wrong. So what you need to have is a flexibility that says we're willing to try different models and different approaches and keep them under evaluation to guide us on the way, because during that time people's attitudes will change. You know, we're in the process of coming through out of lockdown at the moment, which means a lot of people have got out of the habit of traveling, they've got out of the habit of lots of personal contact and all that kind of stuff. In 6 months' time, will we be the same? Will we be different? We don't know, and therefore I think keeping that idea of flexibility is important. But Dave, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of good things that have come out of this whole challenge that we've had. So, for instance, you know, I'm talking to you in California, but last week I was doing a seminar for people in Dubai, and I work a lot with people, you know, in continental Europe, without traveling, without leaving home, without having to spend all that time and energy and carbon and all the kind of stuff that comes from that. So there's lots of things there. But at the heart of this, as human beings, close personal contact is important to us in terms of forming trust and bonds. So whilst we're in this thing here, you've been here when you're in a bar with a bunch of friends, and there's 3 or 4 people talking simultaneously, and there's people laughing, and there's people side conversation. You don't do that on Zoom. On Zoom, it's a one at a time thing. We kind of talk one at a time, which is completely unnatural. And therefore the quality of our communication, I think, is diminished a little bit by the technology as it stands. However, the technology is a huge boost in many other ways. So I think I've fudged the answer there, Dave.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I think that's good stuff. So pressing forward here a little bit, again, looking at culture from the organizational lenses that you guys have had, they were very large, tens of thousands of employees, disparate, so employees all over the place. Well, I think all companies, small and large, face now that disparity, right? Your employees are out. They're not necessarily gathered in a central location. COVID has forced that. So even small companies are dealing with what you two had to deal with on an ongoing basis, just leading the organizations you were leading. So I think it's relevant that movement has pressed down into the small business world now. How do we get culture from where we are out into the world? And so that's the sort of the framework for this question. You have all of these corporate functions, whether it's finance or operations, whatever it might be. How did you take culture and create maybe champions within each of the functional roles, or how did you get it out into the organization? Dave,
Okay.
you want to take a swing at that?
I'll let Bob go after this.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Brian, we've already talked about a couple of examples of how HR changed their way of thinking to kind of adopt a different mindset in terms of how to manage the business, and that made the cultural imperative real for them, was change the way we do things. let me give you an example from another couple of functions. For instance, there's an example I shared in my the TEDx talk that I did on doing core values. There was one of the ways of getting the culture out into the business that I chose to do is I had a communication plan that was on about 12 different layers, and one of the layers was a weekly blog to the whole organization. And the weekly blog to the whole organization was something that I was going to craft, and I was going to use my Shakespearean writing skills to write something that was so compelling that people would read it and they would drink in my thoughts and they would instantaneously get what I was going for, and everybody would buy into it. I couldn't have been further from the truth, because what I did was I wrote something that was probably pretty mediocre in the outset. Then I handed it to my comms team, and the comms team's job they'd been told over many years, your job is to make sure that nobody says anything that could get us into trouble at any point during the future, and to take out any references to it that might be not consistent with the corporate model. So basically what they did was they sucked the life out of all the messages. They got rid of everything personal. They changed the language to make it more like the kind of the standard language. They corrected all my spelling mistakes. They took out all my cultural references that they thought people might not get, and they turned it into something really bland and grey. Needless to say, when we started posting them, putting them out there, people didn't bother reading them because they were just more management nonsense. So I spoke to a few people who gave me that feedback. They said, look, we don't read them anymore because they're not of any use to us and they're not that interesting. I went, right, that's great. So let's go back to basics. So I said to the comms function, when you went to school, when you studied communications, it was all about how to get people to want to listen to that. I said, yeah, but in a corporate environment, it's the opposite way about. I said, what if we just flipped it around and said, your job now is to actually help me to communicate, not to keep me safe. They went, oh. I said, so what I'm looking for now is creativity. I'm looking for ideas. I'm looking for support. I want you to stop me sending out things that are boring. I want you to stop me sending out things that are too long. I want you to help me to come across more like me. And they went, oh, wow, we've never been asked this before. We flipped the switch. And by flipping the switch, they became my biggest allies. They're the ones that would say to me, look, that's a great draft that you've done there, Bob, but it's too boring. We need to up the ante. I want you to get references in there to something to do with your family. I want you to talk about Elvis. I want you to talk about money. I want you to get something in there that people relate to, and they helped. So after we did that, the first one that I put out, it was called Your Baby is Ugly. Nobody deleted that message without opening it. Everybody opened that up, and the next one that week after that was called Thoughts of Death and Beauty. Again, people opened these things up, and this was before the term clickbait was actually a thing, because behind that we had a message that was consistent with the title that people could get something to, single page. And as a result of that, I wrote probably 500 of these weekly blogs, and still to this day, people will send copies back to me and say, this was the one that resonated with me, or I'll remember the time you talked about this. So they're out there circulating, and each one of these was only there because the comms department functionally changed from being one way to another because they understood it. The second one I would talk about is an example from the legal department. Now, in the business that I was operating, it was a hazardous environment. Occasionally people would get hurt. And when people get hurt, we had to go through various processes and things like that. And we also recorded the frequency of these things, and we produced nice graphs. But we gave them terminology like, we called it a recordable case frequency and all that, which tended to dehumanize it because we were missing the reality of these things. It was having an impact on people, their families and friends. And I was asking, I said, look, why don't we call them, instead of calling them injured parties, why don't we give them names and talk about their age and where they live and how many children they've got to make it real for people? And the lawyers came to me and said, we're nervous. We can't mention people's names because of privacy concerns. And we shouldn't express any concerns or remorse because it implies potential liability. Now, in the UK, we've got a term for that. It's called bollocks, or more politely, nonsense. And I said to the lawyers, I said, you're offsetting a very small risk here against a much larger risk that we've come across as lacking compassion, lacking humanity, and not standing up to the principles or values. So we flipped it around. And our monthly management reports started off with the names of the people who'd been injured, where they live, their family circumstances, what the impact was having on them. And it made it real for people and said, this is real important to us. It's no longer just a graph on page 3 of the report that shows trends going up and down. And again, the legal department were with me on that. They said, there is an element of risk here, but on balance, we now recognize it's your job to take that risk, not ours. So we're happy that we've advised you, and we're also happy that you've ignored our advice. So they became passive supporters of what I was trying to do and came on board. That's my 2 examples to support that one.
Yeah, before we transition to Dave, one of the things I've heard Bob say in the past is that people, they trust who they know and they follow who they trust.
Yeah.
There is something about being known, and that Bob's speaking to here, and Bob putting out communications that were personal. Bob becoming known to the people that were following him.
Yeah.
The point is, if you're not known, you can't be trusted. If you're not trusted, you're not followed. So if people don't know you, who are you leading is the question Bob poignantly asks. And that's true. You have to be known first, then trusted, and then you'll be followed. And I love that. I think that might have been in your TEDx talk that you did that.
It comes from a study that was done in New York back in 1999 by the New York Times and CBS together. However, a great illustration of that is that because I was putting out these notes every week, because I was putting out videos every month, and because I was doing lots of other things, people who I'd never met felt as though they knew me. They'd heard my voice, they'd heard my Scottish accent, they'd done all that kind of stuff. You know, like you and I, Brian, we've never physically met, and you think, well, we know this person. So the first time I set foot in our office in Greenville, South Carolina, I turned up at the door of the office and they went, Bob, you're back. You're back. And I went, I've never been here before. And they went, it's great to see you again. How are you doing? And invited in as if they knew me already. And I thought, there's the real sign that this works, because people, as I say, who've never met me, felt comfortable enough to treat me as if I was a returning friend, rather than a scary visit from a nameless CEO who might be coming to shut the place down or whatever it happens to be.
That's good stuff. How about you, Dave, with regards to getting this? You had the monumental task. I don't even know how I would wrap my head around what you were asked to do by Steve, and that is shift the culture of this whole organization. So how did you do that? How did you get out into such a large global organization and start making an impact? By the way, before I ever met you, I would hear things from people that I knew at UnitedHealth Group. UnitedHealth Group always had this culture. They pay really well. It's wage slavery. You can't leave because you can never replace your income, but they work you to death. And it's this juxtaposition every employee found themselves in. However, you showed up on the scene, and I'm starting to hear ripples of what's going on. So beyond you and what you did, that ripple effect went out into the marketplace. I hear that as a recruiter, like their culture is changing. They're doing things to impact their culture. So how did you do that?
So when we started our culture journey, Steve Hemsley, our CEO, was very clear that he wasn't interested in a cultural transformation because we wanted to be good guys and gals. He wanted better results. Some of the same scenarios that Bob has already given stories about with financial results. Steve was very clear that all the metrics are going to stay the same and I expect them to be better. So what I saw was not necessarily culture transformation. I need to figure out better results, but I also saw that there was some low-hanging fruit because of the scenario you just described of how you treat people. And I firmly believed that if you empower people and allow the creativity and innovation to come out, they will figure out better ways most of the time than the senior management just issuing an edict without having all the details. So a few examples of the functional areas, all of which come through what Bob and I think hopefully you'll take as a common theme of a values lens for every decision. Because if you look at it through a different prism, you will get a different answer. So from the communications perspective, the prevalent thought at the time was, well, we can't communicate too much. We're going to have communication fatigue. And if they get too many messages, our people, they're going to get fatigued. We shifted that and we had a weekly culture digest every single week on a set schedule. and it was always different. I didn't have the titles that Bob had. I love those titles in the subject line, but it was not something where it was the traditional communications that Bob referred to. So from the communications department, we had a weekly communications area. From a finance department, given that United Health Group was driven by a lot of ex-Arthur Andersen and financial people, we had all learned very well the two rules of a CFO. Rule number one, just say no. Because you know that when you say no, they're always going to come back with a better answer. Rule number two, see rule number one. So it just kept coming back. Well, now the financial folks started listening, in my opinion, a little bit differently, and started to ask really good questions that helped that person come up with a better answer instead of just saying no. And that was felt throughout the organization. Third area, marketing. As Bob mentioned earlier, there's nothing as unique as your own DNA. Well, our core values were our DNA. So we created brand ambassadors to go out there and start to talk to the public based on our core values. And that exists to this day. Fourth area, HR. So many ways that HR can enable the culture of an organization, or so many ways they can block the transformation of an organization. When you talk about transformation, I had the idea, which Steve backed up, that everything could change, or else it wouldn't be a transformation. Everything was fair game. There's a book from a human resource function that was very helpful to me. It's called Built on Values. It's written by a woman named Ann Rhodes, who is the head of HR for Southwest Airlines and then JetBlue. In it are chapters on performance management, compensation, orientation, recruitment, all of which go through a values lens, very, very useful, that helped us do it. But one of the stories that I found most meaningful was by our operations. One of our senior vice presidents had 3,000 consumer advocates that reported to her. And when people would call in with their problems, because no one calls a health company because they're so pleased and happy with their health insurance, they called in, and most of the time it'd be a very difficult call. And particularly in the Medicare function, when you're dealing with people that are older, many times financial resources are very limited, health is very frail. There's a lot of fear and anxiety that's going to come through as well. This senior executive had the idea that for the month of February, she wanted to make it a month of compassion. Compassion was one of our 5 core values that we defined as walking in the shoes of the people that you work with and those with whom you serve. Going back to Bob's point, words are very important. We defined every one of those values very clearly. To do that, she said, let's try something really new. I'd like every one of the 3,000 advocates to write 5 thank you notes sometime during the month of February. Those thank you notes will have no script. There will be no legislation from HR, legal, communications, marketing. We're going to turn you loose to say whatever's on your heart that you want to say to one of those people that you spoke to, that you helped. Well, got through all that, gave them stamps, envelopes, everything they needed from supplies. I caught up with this executive 3 or 4 months after the fact, and I said, how did that go? She said, Dave, we've completely changed our process to now do it every month. We wrote 15,000 thank you notes during that month. We've now written 60,000 thank you notes. And guess what? The members are writing notes back to us. In fact, several members have sent gift baskets, fruit baskets to the call center for those people to share with their colleagues, because they've never, ever had any company, let alone a health insurance company, say thank you with real, true gratitude, not just some pithy statement that comes from a department. So all of those things come together to be back through the values lens and allow each senior leader to have a simple challenge. What would you do differently when you look through this lens that you wouldn't have done perhaps before? Because as Bob mentioned, most of what I found is it just needs a little encouragement and permission. I think every human being has it in their heart to show compassion, has it in their heart to show gratitude, all of those things. But in a corporate environment, what I found at United is we had stuffed it in there. And particularly with our clinicians, who are breathing, caring, and compassion. We just said, nope, we got to make money. And once you take that off, guess what? We made more money. And that just came through, and every KPI improved over those 9 years that I was left before I left in 19. Hopefully that helps.
Terrific. Dave, a question that came up is, can you give more description of the culture ambassador? Was that a part of their jobs, or was it a full-time job? And how would things get shared with the public regarding the company as well?
Yeah, so we started out with those workshops that I mentioned earlier. And as people came through the workshops, oftentimes they were very moved and wanted to do more. And so they came to me because I had this label, which was part-time at the start. I was doing my full-time job and helping Steve with the culture work. And they said, we want to do more. What can we do? And I said, I have no idea. What do you want to do? Well, we think we ought to do this and that. And I said, great, go do it. And it was no one's full-time job other than what eventually became my full-time job, along with my staff of 5 people. There were 6 of us for 325,000 people. And other than that, everything was voluntary. We simply gave them the label under the definition of an ambassador. When you think of an ambassador of the United States to Scotland, what is that person there to do? They're there to represent, to represent the United States to Scotland. And they're empowered on many, many fronts to do a lot of different things in that relationship. Well, that's what we did with culture. We said, you're a culture ambassador. Go out and prosper. We're going to say yes to almost everything we can. And I don't recall ever saying no to anyone. And off they went. The innovation started going crazy. It got Steve's attention. He started then coming to, we started a Culture Ambassador Summit, started out with 150 people in the first year. It grew to over 7,000 people in 2018 in almost every office we had. We did it simultaneously with technology and in person with our culture facilitators. So out of that group of culture ambassadors, which eventually reached 22,000 people that called themselves culture ambassadors, within that was a segment of the population that was particularly interested in marketing and branding. And so those people were then given a little additional training from marketing about how to go into the public and represent the company and our DNA to the public. So that's just a snapshot of, that's a whole nother call on culture ambassadors that we could talk about.
Oh, it's great stuff. Really great stuff. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and maybe it's a lot of bit. I'm not sure how you'll perceive the shift, but we're going to talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. It is one of the hot button topics today. Obviously, everyone cares about inclusive and diverse environments. So I think when we look at the values of the organizations, respectively, that you two were a part of, we don't necessarily see value statements of diversity or of inclusion. Talk to me about your perspective of that and how you brought that to bear within the organizations that you led.
Okay, you want me to kick off, given Dave's just
Yeah, please do.
Break there. For me, the beauty of having a culture based on solid values such as respect, honesty, fairness, compassion, and that is that they apply universally to everyone. And because they apply to everyone and everyone's expected to apply them to their colleagues, then they help to eliminate discrimination. They help to address the unconscious bias that we all potentially suffer from. So it kind of, you're addressing it at the root cause rather than trying to address the symptoms or trying to, create quotas, etc., that might help you to manage the appearance of diversity and inclusion by saying, look, let's treat people as human beings and let's give everybody a kind of equal exposure and equal say on this. And let's recognize that, we are all biased by who we know, who we trust, where we are, how we grew up, and all that kind of stuff. So it helps. Now, if we look at diversity through the lenses of, gender diversity, sexuality, race, nationalities, religion, diversity of beliefs and thinking, there's also something there about a diversity of thought, without using that as an excuse not to do anything about the other elements of diversity. for me, it always came back to this idea is that talented people who have got the right attitude should be given the opportunity to thrive, irrespective of who they are, where they came from, what gender they are, what school they went to. Now, coming from Britain, you'll know that Britain has a long history of class discrimination, you know, with royal families and dukes and earls and all the stuff you see on the period dramas on Netflix and all the other stuff that comes up here. However, I would say that in Scotland, we're the part of Britain that the Romans never managed to invade. We're the northern part there. We're slightly different in a sense that we don't have that sense. There's a much more egalitarian sense at mind here. There's a phrase we use in Scotland called "we're all Jock Tamson's bairns." Now, Jock Tamson, or Thompson as it's properly said, was a minister of the church in the 19th century from a place called Duddingston in Edinburgh. And a bairn is a child. It's a sort of word for Scotland's in child. And it reflects the fact that we're all the same fundamentally. We're all human beings fundamentally, irrespective of the colour of your skin, your gender, your religion, or whatever. Now, I went to a state school. I was brought up in a house that was rented from the local council, but I was never considered to be poor. I was considered to be normal. That's what everybody else did as well. I had the same opportunity as everyone else. And for me, that's at the heart of diversity and inclusion, is about creating opportunities for people, particularly those people in society that might not share that. So let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate how that applied in the culture of a larger organization. We were working in Bangladesh, in a place called Sanggu on the outskirts of Chittagong in Bangladesh. And part of our core values were about being good corporate citizens and making a positive differences to the communities where we operated. Now we had a team operating in this village of Sanggu outside Chittagong. We said, what difference are we making other than providing employment and paying our taxes and all the other stuff that comes with it? And the team came back and they said, we've identified a really critical local need. Because Chittagong is in a place where rich Western countries send their old ships to be broken. So if an old oil tanker is no longer in service, they run it up onto the beach outside Chittagong, and then they find the cheapest labor possible to dismantle it by hand. And the cheapest labor you can get is young children. So they pay young children from about the age of 4 years old, the equivalent of 50 cents a day to come and do incredibly dangerous work without the correct potential equipment, etc. And these children never go to school, and they're in that economic trap of living hand to mouth and not having enough jobs and all the kind of stuff that goes with it. And we recognize that the way out of poverty is education. But we also realized there weren't enough places in the education system. However, the real problem was that the education system had some entry qualifications. Children had to demonstrate that they could read, write, and count to a minimal degree before they would be accepted into the education system. Now, for children who have parents that are literate and keen and educated, that's no problem. But for children who don't have parents, or for children whose parents don't have that privilege, then they were caught in this trap. So we said, well, why don't we set up some schools? And by schools, I mean huts. Why don't we set up some huts? So we set up 25 schools. We paid some teenage girls a relatively modest wage to come along and teach groups of children between the 4 and 8 years old the basic reading, writing, and counting skills. We would carry out bags when we were traveling out there full of pencils and paper and chalk and books, and take them out and distribute around the schools. And what it did was, after about 10 weeks, these kids were at a level where they were able to pass the entry exam and get into the state education program. And often this was the first time in the history of the family that any of them had been exposed to full-time education. However, there was an economic thing here. Because these children could have been earning 50 cents a day doing dangerous work on breaking up ships, we had to pay them. So we paid them $1 a day for coming to school. And by paying them $1 a day to come to school, the commercial incentive was there. And I'm pleased to say that, by the time we kind of left that whole project, over 3,000 children have graduated from our schools in Sanggu. And we did that because our core values said that's what we should be doing. Second example, the 13th of November 2009 was a Friday the 13th, and it was a really sad day because on the television station here in Scotland, there was a news story about a workshop for the blind and disabled closing down. This workshop was called Glencraft, and they made beds and mattresses. They'd been in existence for 163 years at this point, but the economic conditions meant that effectively they were losing money, they couldn't find support, and about 50 odd people, all of whom had different types of physical and learning disability, found themselves being told that society no longer needs you. So myself and my CFO were watching this with some interest. And the following week, I'd heard a lot of people saying somebody should do something about this, but nobody was giving any answers. And so I spoke to my CFO and I said, so should we ask a few questions? Is there anything we might do? And he said, interesting, you should say that. We have an appointment with the person that's been set up to put the company into liquidation. We went along and we realized that the business was being run like a charity. And if there was no financial discipline, there was no controls, there was no sales, there was no marketing, and it was in a spiral of not being able to sell its products. And we said, look, if we change the business model, if we put some marketing, some business development in there, if we got a proper HR function in there, etc., we could transform this. The upshot was in April the next year, we managed to reopen the facility. Every single person came back, got their jobs back on the same terms and conditions. There was no dilution of that. And I'm pleased to say that the Glencraft facility operates successfully to this day. And actually last week won a Queen's Award for export because they're now selling online and they're selling into big stores and they're bringing in new people with partial sighted, blind, learning difficulties to give them the dignity that they get from having a purposeful life. And they can complain about the football results and paying taxes rather than the fact that there's nothing for them to do. So we did that again because of the values and because of this idea that by giving people opportunity, it addresses the core dilemma around diversity and inclusion. Dave, I'll throw that ball in your direction and you can catch that one.
Yeah, thank you. Great stories. I was scribbling them down. Love that. So at UnitedHealth Group, when we first reorchestrated our values and redefined them, there was a good discussion in the room about diversity and inclusion because that had been one of the 3 core values of the corporate entity. However, we had 7 segments and all 7 segments had different core values. So we literally had a matrix and we basically said, look, we want to take a fresh start. We want to look at this thing holistically. We landed on the word relationships. And our definition of relationships was build trust through collaboration. We then took the language from the corporate diversity and inclusion value and wove that into what we believe, what we value, and how we should behave. So the language is the first step that we felt was important to ensure that we solidified as to what we expected out of people. Then taking that values lens, we said, all right, what does that mean? And we wanted to focus on the unification of all of our employees, as Bob mentioned, regardless of where they came from or where they sat or what they believed, around what we at UnitedHealth Group, as citizens of UnitedHealth Group, what could we all subscribe to? And if you were to read through that language, you would, I think, find your head shaking. There's just, it's noble. It's wonderful. And the same could be true with all 5 of our values: integrity, compassion, relationships, innovation, and performance. Well, then we said, what does it mean? And how will that manifest itself through our organization? Well, because a lot of us at UnitedHealth Group felt we were very deficient in that value of relationships, we again put emphasis on it through our culture ambassadors. And we created a sub-segment called Relationship Builders. And we had executives from around the company that were very successful with the relationships come in and just share openly how they built relationships. And a lot of that was not only external to the firm, but also internal to the firm. Within the growth of UnitedHealth Group, which has been primarily through acquisition over all these years, we also brought in people from an M&A group and said, as they both court a potential acquiree and then how we integrate How can we learn from that? And how does our value of relationships play through all of it? Going again through the values lens. Well, then we asked more for each department. And this again came from Hemsley, our CEO, saying, how are you going to make relationships real in whatever it is you're doing? And first and foremost, he was thinking about the marketplace, but he knew that the marketplace would not be affected fully without the unification of our employees. And again, some very noble things came out of that. Healthcare literacy, to look and if you look at the language of your health insurance policy, most of you would, and myself included, would still shake our heads and go, wow, that's a lot of mumbo jumbo about something that's very important eventually to me. So how do we make the language simpler? So we actually started a department that had not been there before on healthcare literacy. Well, guess what? We then discovered different ethnicities had different challenges with different words within that system. So we then created a full-on focus on healthcare access, which had always been part of our mantra about healthcare and evidence-based healthcare, but now it became real because the language was not understandable, certainly with different populations across the United States. I'll pick on one in New York City. Within the Asian population, we found that it made no sense at all. Well, I think the leaders had enough sense to say, we're going to change the KPI instead of, at least for the short-term margin, we're going to look at members. Let's grow the membership. Let's get people involved in the healthcare plan. We'll worry about the margin later. And so radical changes took place to increase the access. And then over time, you start working into the economics of the business. So diversity and inclusion for us was not an HR issue, although it is from a functional perspective. We tried to make it everyone's issue under the lens of our relationships value to then build it where it wasn't setting up special groups. We did not advocate special groups, special interest. We said, no, we're all the same. We are all needing to build relationships with each other. And through that, we still value all the innovation that comes from individual thinking, then passing it through the lens of our common values.
Terrific. Dave, there was a quick question from the previous conversation. Just did the ambassadors, culture ambassadors, get paid more or reduce other responsibilities to make room for this?
They didn't get paid 1 cent more, nor did their responsibilities decrease. It was all volunteer. So we literally started the volunteer organization within the corporation. And we had everyone from CEOs down to the lowest level of the organization that could join the culture ambassadors. They just needed to believe and have a little bit of passion on it. And what we found is that became an outlet for many people who were not able to express it fully through their department. You know, not everyone became a full-fledged believer, if you will, of our united culture, despite many, many efforts. I mean, it's a big ship to turn with 325,000 people, but it allowed them to express themselves, find a common passion from other ambassadors that energized and reinforced, very important. Reinforcement was huge to say this isn't going to just be a one-time shot. And that's how we saw the ambassador group continue to grow over the years and get results, and particularly better results for their departments. Because we started to do a heat map on how many ambassadors were in each department. That started to wake people up. It's like, oh, how many ambassadors do you need? How many should we have? We said, we think every employee should be an ambassador. I mean, there's not it was nowhere in our hierarchical function. You'd never see it on an org chart, but we set up this, it became an organization unto itself with no hierarchical structure. They were simply, we were all simply ambassadors.
I love it. All right, we have 10 minutes. So I'm going to squeeze some time out of the two of you here. I know that's going to be hard. And trust me, I understand. So measurement, I want to talk about measurement. There's probably two axioms I want to touch on. One is you measure what you treasure, and the other being if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So under those two rubrics, culture is not the easiest thing to measure. How do you measure the impact of changing culture? Bob, I'll throw this one to you first. What do you think about that?
I'm going to refer back to Dave here. Is that um, if fundamentally you think that culture is good for business, then you can measure it using the same ways you've always measured your business. You can look at it, you can see it appearing in your retention rates for your staff, your attraction rates for new people, your margins, your business success rates, your sales rates, all the kind of stuff there. It should manifest itself measurably in the normal results of your business. And if it doesn't, then perhaps you've got questions to ask about the authenticity or the depth or the appropriateness of the culture that you're trying to put in place. So that's the first thing I would say. I've had pushback and challenge on this a few times, particularly from a couple of large organizations in the professional services sector, saying that we've put in place our core values and we've now got metrics up all over our offices telling us what our culture is, and we've got traffic light indicators and we've got pie charts and all that. And I said, well, good on you guys. Well done to you. I said, I've only been doing this for 15 years now, and it's still too early for me to do that. They've only been doing it for 15 weeks and they were on it as well. And I worried the fact that the drive to find some sort of analog metric that was like equivalent to being able to measure, profit and loss by department, etc., drove people into thinking, let's find indicators that actually are tokens rather than authentic indicators. I mean, I could easily have come up with metrics. For instance, I could have said, look, I've got a core values awards program. The number of entries for that program has to say something about the culture. But what am I going to do with the number? What am I going to do if it goes down or up? It really doesn't matter. So I'm going to try and make sure that I go out there and sell the value of what we're doing and allow people to come to their conclusion at doing it without beating them with a stick to say, we need to get this up by 5% in your area. So it tends to undermine the kind of mantra that you set me up with there, Harry, about, we treasure what we measure. There's lots of things in life that we don't measure. So if you think about your home life, how many KPI charts have you got on the wall of your kitchen about the performance of you with your domestic tasks or the performance of your partner with other tasks, etc.? We don't do that, and yet nobody's saying that's not important. We don't, so it's a simplistic approach for me to say that if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. We manage lots of things about our lives without measuring them, and we get by just fine. And I think on the culture thing, for instance, for me, one of the things I kept an eye on was how many stories people were sharing with me. So I'd put a story out into the business. It was like throwing a rock into a pond, and the ripples would go on. And if people came back to me and said, look, Bob, this resonates with me, and here's a story that I've got, then clearly one of my things I could do was take that story, top and tail the story, and send it back out, untie it to another rock and throw it back in the pond, and it would ripple again. And it was a great way of being able to stimulate more and more from this. But I didn't worry about whether some weeks there was 100 of these coming in and the next week there was only 10. It didn't signal a crisis to me, and it didn't matter to me that we didn't have accurate charts in that, because at the end of the day, if I looked at the bottom right-hand corner of the profit and loss account, I'm saying there's a good indication of whether or not the culture's having an impact.
So I'll tag on to that in 2 minutes. Ready, go. So when Steve first started the cultural journey, those of us in the business just said, this can't be real. Steve Hemsley wants to change the culture. It was just, didn't make any sense. When he asked me to get involved in it, I was very hesitant and very skeptical until he said, this is a 30-year journey.
Yeah.
And it was not a short-term play. And even though we're a large Fortune 5 public company, it was for the long term. And that gave me a lot of relief, but also even more energy about, okay, we've got time to do this the right way in going to the building blocks. The other mantra I would throw out for all of your consideration is all that matters can't be measured. To go to Bob's point of our home lives and all these other things, how do you measure spirit and energy and alignment and unity? All of us have seen, if we pick a sports team's analogies, we've seen sports teams laden with talent, but yet they're not successful in the outcome of winning X number of games. Well, most of it will come back to the culture of the team. And how do you define culture, which we've already been through. Testimonials matter quite a bit. And we saw that from senior leaders at UnitedHealth Group, where we had an annual award that we gave at our senior leadership team meeting. And it was for the most successful results, the best project or program within UnitedHealth Group. And they had to submit entries. Of course, we had forms to fill out and all these other things, which, by the way, was spawned from our United culture as an idea to start recognizing people more. We had a huge project that spanned multiple years. It had failed twice before of integrating our large PBMs together. And that year it succeeded. When the leader stood up to receive the award, the first thing he said, non-scripted, was, "This could not have happened without our United culture." Wow. I mean, when you get something like that tied up in all the metrics that defined the success of the program, but he attributed it to culture. I was sitting in the audience going, man, I hope we caught that on tape, because that, going to Bob's point of the stories, start to tell the true story. And one last analogy within my 2 minutes, change management. I've been a change management fan for years. I've never figured out how to measure objectively change management. And I've read books, I've done it myself, I've talked to speakers. There's no way to prove that change management works, in my opinion. However, I think all of us could show you train wreck after train wreck when change management principles are not applied. I would simply suggest that culture transformation is change management on steroids. I can show you UnitedHealth Group before. We can have story after story, as Brian introduced the reputation of UnitedHealth Group, and now we have it today. What changed? Our United culture. So back to you on measurement, Brian.
I appreciate it. This has been great, and I'm going to kind of wrap up here. And it's just with profound respect and gratitude that I just want you guys to know I'm honored that you did this for us and for the audience. I mean, this is great stuff. Your voices are important. The stories that you share, obviously, stories are vital to our human existence. And so those stories that get propagated out and shared, and those ripple effects, hopefully will be profound for people. And for all the audience, we will be following up with an email, just seeking your feedback, your perspectives, where you would like to see this go. We don't want this to die as a single conversation. We, again, are trying to imagine that playbook of how do we create environments, corporate environments, where human beings can flourish. What are sort of the prerequisites to do that, and what does that playbook potentially look like? That's where we're trying to drive at. How we do that, really unknown at this point, but we will be following up with you. Thank you for showing up. Again, thanks to Dave and Bob. Thanks to Harry, who is sort of the background architect of the technology, the platform here, so appreciate that. And we will be in touch with everybody again real soon. Thanks again, everyone.